All right. Should we begin then? Now that Rob has his screen shared. I am Amy Ebbison from Worcester Addresses Childhood Trauma. I'm so grateful to Dr. Zarges and Lynn Barrio. Did I say that all right?
You did.
Okay, good. For being here today. They are here at the request of Dr. Lori Ross, and we're so grateful that she invited them for this topic that is incredibly important for our work in childhood trauma. The work you guys do, it can't be stated enough how much it means to people. We're super grateful for it. So we'll, leave it to you to talk about the work you're doing, to let people know how they can get involved. I'm sure there's people that would love to. And again, we're gonna ask you to mute yourself if you're not Rob or Lynn. And if you have questions or comments, you can put those in the chat. They're gonna present for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for comments and questions. And I'm gonna turn it over. Thank you, Rob.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So it's really a privilege to be here with you all. And thank you, Amy and Lori, for including us and all the great work that you're doing through the task force and the group of people that are gathered to really address an issue that's very important when it comes to the population of kids that we work with, obviously kids that are in the foster care system. So we're going to spend a little bit of time and introduce you to CASA first, and then talk a little bit about how the separation experience for kids being removed from their homes because of abuse and neglect impacts the trauma that they've already experienced. Talk a little bit about toxic stress and how to deal with that when you're a caretaker or working with kids that are in the foster care system, and I guess it would apply to the juvenile justice system as well. And we'll go from there, and we'll do some questions. So for our all right, so now I got to figure out how to make these slides. There we go. So I'm Robb Zarges. I'm the Executive Director at CASA. I've been here just about 4 years with CASA. Previous to that, I had about a 25-year career working with runaway and homeless youth and kids in the juvenile justice system that were transitioning back to the community. And so I've been working with high risk, high trauma exposed kids for my entire adult life, and I can't imagine doing anything different. I don't know if that says more about how wonderful the kids are that I've been had the privilege to have relationships with over the last 30 years, or how crazy that makes me. I'm not sure which, but really enjoy working with kids that really need relationships, right? And that's what it's all comes down to, is we're going to be talking about the need for relationships for kids along. I have Lynn with me. Lynn is the Assistant Director. And Lynn, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I'm Lynn Barrio. I've been with CASA 20 years in a couple different roles. I'm now the Assistant Director, and previously I was a therapist for kids that had fairly severe ADHD, and have worked with kids my entire career. I teach a couple classes at Mount Wachusett Community College, and really happy to be here, meet everybody, say hi, and talk a little bit about our organization. So thank you.
So our contact information is up there. If you want to reach out to us at any time, we're more than happy to answer any questions that we don't get to during the hour here. And there's our website and our office number as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of CASA. CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. And really it started as a independent movement, a national movement of people that really felt like kids needed independent voices when it came to their appearance in court, whether that be in the juvenile justice system or in the family court system, or what we call the juvenile court here in Massachusetts. Judges realized pretty early on, especially in the foster care system, that they were making these kind of incredibly important decisions about the lives of children, but they were not hearing one voice, because one voice was not in the courtroom. You walk into any juvenile court in Massachusetts and you realize that pretty quickly it's about the parents, it's about DCF, and it's about the judge, and the only person that's not in the courtroom is the child. And so in 1977, a judge in King County, Washington, the Seattle area, Judge David Sukup, said, you know what, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to figure out a way in which we can get the kids a voice into the court proceedings. And so he stepped down from the bench and he started to recruit volunteers from the community that would act as the eyes and ears of the judge. They would go and they would do an independent investigation of what happened, why the child was removed from the home, how they were doing in foster care, talk to everybody on the case, whether it be a therapist or a teacher or anyone else involved with that child's life. And then they would write reports and bring it back to the judge on the best interests of that child. What they determined after talking to all of these people that were involved with this child's life, what they believed was in the best interest of this child. And it was so successful that the federal government decided that they wanted to do an expansion of what was happening in Seattle. And in 1981, they put out a demonstration grant throughout the country, and CASA project in Worcester was one of the awardees. And we were one of the first CASA programs in the country to be able to start replicating what they were doing in Seattle, Washington. Because some of the state statutes require guardian ad litems to be an attorney, that's why the term court-appointed special advocates was created to describe the role of a volunteer in the community playing the role of a guardian ad litem. In Massachusetts, a volunteer CASA is actually a GAL, and so we make sure that what we call them CASAs in the court system. In 1982, the National CASA Association was formed and in Seattle, and they oversee the coordination of all the programs throughout the country. And currently, as of yesterday, there was 978 CASA programs throughout the country in 49 states in the District of Columbia, and they usually are represented by county. So that's kind of the history of where CASA came from. But in Worcester County, if we look at the issue in Worcester County and why CASA Worcester County exists, every year in Massachusetts, there's about 8,700 children that are removed from their homes because of abuse or neglect. So that's 8,700 children. In Worcester County, that's approximately 1,700. About 1,700 a year are removed and put into foster care. Most of these children are younger than the age of 12, and nearly half are under 6. In 1981, we were founded, as I said already, and we are really a public-private partnership with the court, Department of Children and Families, and community volunteers. While we are independent and our own 501c3, we do work with and alongside the court system here, the juvenile court system, as well as DCF, and we recruit and train volunteers from the community. We currently serve, last year we served right around 900 children with about 350 volunteers that are doing the work, and Lynn's going to explain what we do in a second. But our goal really is twofold. Obviously, we want to be able to speak for, fight for, and serve every child that's placed in foster care in Worcester County with the dual goal of minimizing the amount of time that children are in foster care and the number of placements. And one of the reasons why we have those two goals in Worcester County, because that's not true of every CASA, is that we know that those are the two most stable indicators of a child entering either the juvenile justice or criminal justice system or becoming homeless upon their release from foster care. So we want to see less time in foster care and fewer placements. And that's kind of the way we set up our vision and mission to move forward. Lynn's going to talk a little bit about what we do.
Thanks, Rob. So I think one of the first things that I want to say is part of the reason that I think that CASA is so effective and so used in Worcester County is in Massachusetts, although children are appointed an attorney, they are appointed to represent the children's wishes, not their best interests. So we are considered best interest GALs in the juvenile court, and that's where all of our advocacy stems from, is what we believe is in a child's best interest. We certainly take into account what's happening in the family. We try and provide the judge with the most global view of what's happening, in that child's life at any particular moment. But we are there to speak on behalf of a child. And quite often, children's attorneys will request a CASA. That's another thing, right? You can't just call our office and request a CASA be put on a case. All of our appointments come through the juvenile court, through a judge. That's the only way that we're appointed, and we're only appointed on care and protection cases, not on cases in which families are there voluntarily with DCF. Probably one of our earliest, biggest supporters, and somebody that maybe a lot of you know, is the Honorable retired Judge Luis Perez, who I think for many years tolerated CASA. Those are his words. And then I think there was a day where he found that the attorneys in front of him were not, he had different information from the children on the case than he was receiving from the attorneys. And I think that was a real turning point for him. And then began appointing us to almost all of his cases out of Fitchburg and Leominster juvenile courts. And that's around the time, probably 2010, 2011, that our numbers really started to increase in the system. But back to volunteers. So we recruit volunteers. That was Judge Sukup's directive. That's what he wanted, was a fresh set of eyes on every case. Not somebody like us, maybe, that has been exposed to trauma, secondary trauma within the system. He wanted a community of volunteers that would be outraged by even the smallest thing that was affecting children. And so we do recruit, but we do find that a lot of people know about us, come to us. We have a lot of people from the medical field. We have many retired educators and active educators. We have lawyers, we have doctors, we have everyone from 21 to 74. I would say that for many years, our volunteers skewed older. They were retired. They were often female. But in the last 5 or 6 years, we've had much, much more diversity, both age, race, ethnicity, that more mirrors the group of children that we serve. They go through 30 hours of training, 20 hours of classroom time, and then there's homework, visits to court, things of that nature. We try and prepare them, for entering people's homes, leaving their own biases at the door as best as they can, and being there for children, right? Our primary job is to investigate what's happening in a child's life and report back to the judge. Those are our responsibilities. We provide reports at almost every hearing on a case. They're not lengthy reports, but they do describe visits that we've had with the children. We speak with collaterals on the case. Schools, therapists, doctors, pediatricians, specialists, daycare providers, anybody that might be involved in that child's life, to let a judge know how that child has made the transition from being removed from their home to being in a foster placement, and how they continue to do. Many of our kids experience, all of our kids experience trauma, right? The trauma of being removed from a home. And what that does to them, what that does to each child, and for each child, it's different, right? It's a different experience. Some children, as we all know, are much more resilient, or able to cope, and other children maybe not. And that's what our volunteers are on the lookout for, as far as what services can we recommend to the court that they receive so that they are the best version of themselves when they get ready to leave foster care, right? Whether that's to be reunified with their biological family, or whether it means their parents' rights have been terminated and they've been freed for adoption. So that's our goal. It's kids, and whatever we can provide for them. Interestingly enough, during this COVID-19 period, while we have still been able to connect with our children, we have kind of taken a different tack. We've been lucky enough to receive some money from the Greater Worcester Community Foundation and various other organizations that have enabled us to put technology in the hands of over probably more than 100 of our children right now, laptops, Chromebooks, tablets, so that they can have visits with their parents, they can have visits with their therapists, they can have visits with their siblings. And that's a very different approach than what a typical CASA volunteer might do prior to the pandemic. I think Rob, have I covered everything that I was supposed to in that?
Sure. In that section, you got the next section talking about the separate.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our children are placed with relatives, which I think eases at times that the trauma that they've experienced, recognizing that there's been a great deal of trauma in their life even prior to them being removed, whether it be substance abuse, domestic violence, physical or sexual abuse. Certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, I can say that probably 60 to 70% of our cases come to us as a result of parent substance abuse. And probably the biggest change in that, I would say, over the course of the last number of years is that previously it was one parent that was experiencing substance abuse and which took away their inability to be an appropriate caretaker. Now what we're finding in many of our families is both parents are substance involved, and children, they can't be at home, right? So they're with a grandparent, they're with an aunt, they're with an uncle. And I think those family members are also struggling not only to raise their grandchildren or their relatives, but how much access they allow the parents to have with their child while they're living in that care. So, and then we have children that don't have relatives that are available, and so they're placed in foster homes. And we really work hard with foster homes to let them know that we're available to help. We work closely with foster parents to find out what their experience has been like with children that are in their care, and how we can keep them there, because not only our experience, right, but evidence would suggest that with each new placement, it just increases the trauma, and certainly has an impact on their psychological health. I think in this day and age where there are less and less foster homes, good matches are fewer and further between for kids. I think a lot of kids are spending their days in DCF offices and are spending their nights in, they'll move from home to home. So there's a great need out there, probably in the last year, for foster parents, even prior to this. I think one of the unknowns for us as we begin to come out of this, because people have not had eyes on children in the last few months, is how many foster parents have actually given their 10-day notice to DCF and children have been removed from their homes. CASA children we check on, we're aware of where their placements are, but I think that a lot of children have been moved in the last 3 months because foster parents they didn't have the financial assistance, or there were increased costs in the home that they couldn't support themselves, and a variety of reasons in which kids have been reunified maybe earlier than expected, and trying to monitor that situation. And even to move home is traumatic for them. So we work closely with our volunteers to identify that trauma and get them the services that they need.
Do you want to talk a little bit about our trauma therapy response?
Yeah, so I think 3 years ago, we have collaborated with Family Services, which is now, I believe, part of Seven Hills. Is that right, Rob? And Harrington Hospital. We did a little bit of work with Luck in the North, and DCF is a collaborator on this as well. And Assumption, we were using Assumption College interns that were providing. They had open slots for children that had mental health needs, and we were able to get kids into counseling, with a little bit of paperwork, literally within 36 to 72 hours, if we could get that paperwork completed. I'd say over the course of the last 3 years, we've been I think our numbers are a little bit over 100, right, Rob, at this point, that we've been able to get in there. We're still looking for a partner in the north that might have some open slots, but it has been incredibly valuable because I think in other situations, kids are on waiting lists for 3, 4, 8, 9 months. And the courts really, Rob describes scenarios in which he's seen when he's been in there on one of his cases where that's just an accepted fact that there's such a lengthy waiting list. And so we tried to branch out just a little bit to see what we could do to create, to lessen some of the barriers to our children receiving mental health services. And unfortunately or fortunately, the pandemic has helped in that sense, because we've been able to make referrals during this period of time, and some of our kids are now able to receive mental health therapy, through a telehealth process. So we get tablets, computers in their hands, and they set up appointments, and foster parents work through that. And it's been more successful than I think we might have anticipated.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think really when it comes down to the issue of kids in the foster care system, we're seeing, the pandemic is playing another whole role in the level of trauma that kids are experiencing, right? Because when they could have had visits with their parents at the DCF office, now those aren't happening. Hopefully they're happening by video visit, but not always. We have a system where we have kids that can do video visits with their parents that are incarcerated. That has all been suspended because there's no movement in any of the prisons. So that is another thing that's been taken away from kids. Our concern is for kids who are not yet in the foster care system during this time, where there's the reported number of care and protections that have been reported to the court is down between, depending on who you talk to, 60 and 80% in Worcester County. I don't think that a pandemic causes people to abuse less. I just think it's not being reported. And so we're very fearful once kids get in front of mandated reporters again on what that may mean for the number of children that are going to be entering into the system that's already overburdened. We don't have enough foster care homes. Our hope is that the community response will be huge when it comes to that. We have foster families that were doing great, and now one of the spouses have lost their job as a result of the pandemic. And not only are they, if they have 2 or 3 kids as foster children, now they're expected to provide 56 more meals a week. That's a cost factor, and they're not getting an increase in their. So there's a lot of things that are causing stress for not only foster families but the kids that we have in our caseload, as well as that are in the foster care system. And so the topic of this seminar was really around what is the effects of trauma, of maltreatment, right? And so when we talk about how kids come into the system, and I know many of you are already familiar with a lot of the terms that we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. But, childhood trauma is really when a child witnesses or experiences an event that poses a real or perceived threat to their life or well-being of themselves or somebody else that they love, right? And so it causes fear, helplessness, and horror, and a child's unable to cope with those intense feelings at some level. When we get kids that are been removed, right, then the removal in and of itself is a traumatic event, right? We would consider that an adverse childhood experience, being removed from your home by a government. That's just the tip of the iceberg for a kid's experience in trauma and the amount of adverse childhood experiences they've had, right? Because something led to them having to be removed for safety reasons. Right, and so they may have experienced 3 or 4 other things before they even get to the point where they're being removed and placed into a foster home. And so a lot of times when you talk about kids that are in the foster care system, they have multiple levels of trauma that they've experienced, and some people are even beginning to say that this pandemic, what's happened over being in lockdown for the last 3 months, is going to be considered a historical trauma, right? And historical trauma being defined as an event that causes trauma, right? So we have multiple levels of trauma that is happening for the kids that are in our care through the foster care system, as well as that are in our caseload in CASA. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the types of trauma, but just for those who maybe are new to this topic, acute trauma is that kind of trauma that is kind of episodic, right? It can be both positive or negative experience of trauma. Chronic trauma is that kind of sustained trauma that happens over and over and over again. Physical abuse, domestic violence, violence in the home, those kinds of things. Complex trauma is those multifaceted levels of trauma where there might be substance abuse, mental illness, and violence in the home. And then historical trauma is usually tied to an event of some sort. And so the problem with trauma, the issue with trauma, obviously, is that it leads to stress, and it leads depending on where the child is and how healthy the relationships are in that child's family, it can lead to what we call toxic stress, right? So when it comes to, I always find this chart very helpful for myself, and so I've just put it up there for our review. But when we start to look at toxic stress, right, which is defined by when a child experiences strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity, such as physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, caregiver, substance abuse, mental illness, exposure to violence, or accumulated hardship of family economic hardship, and they don't have the required adult support, that's what we consider toxic stress, right? So, for instance, a positive stressor in a child's life might be learning how to drive a car. It's very stressful, both for the parent and for the child, to learn how to drive a car, right? But that's a brief exposure to stress. The severity is usually mild or moderate, right? The social emotional buffering with the healthy relationships, family relationships around the child, or other people in their lives, is sufficient to support that exposure to that stress. And then there's this long-term effect on stress response system. The body regulates itself back to normal, right? So we have this experience of stress that elevates all kinds of things in our bodies, and I'm going to let Dr. Forkey be the expert on that. I'm not going to even try to compete. Higher levels of, adrenaline, cortisol, all those things that go on in the brain. But then our body quickly relegates because we have that support system in relationship, right? Whether that be a parent, a coach, or somebody else. So stress, a positive stress experience. Tolerable stress could be positive or negative. It's usually sustained, so it's something that happens over and over again. There's also it could be moderate or severe, the levels of stress that the child is experiencing, but there's still sufficient support for that child. There's still the relationships that help the child get through that stressful, even ongoing stressful experience. And then the body returns to baseline. The response to the response system to the stress back to baseline. Toxic stress is completely different, right? It's sustained, it's severe. There's not a socially emotional buffering system in place, and therefore there's changes that happen in the body physiologically, in the brain, and the way that we respond to stress changes potentially forever without intervention. And that's why toxic stress is so damaging. And for a lot of our children, that what we see is that the people that they look to be that emotional, socio-emotional buffering for them, those relationships that they look to, were the ones causing the harm. So they didn't have the situation in which they had people there that they would normally look to for support, experiencing stress, because they're the ones that were creating the stress in the first place. And that becomes a very challenging scenario for the kids that we see in the foster care system. So, but the reality is we all have these responses to danger or stressors, right? I mean, we all, typically we've heard of three of them, right? The freeze, some people when they're in a stressful situation, they just freeze up, they clamp up, they don't know what to do. Some have a response of fight or flight, right? All of those are kind of primal and responses to stress. That's normal response of the human body. One that we don't talk enough about is the affiliate response. right? And how many of you are familiar with affiliate response? Just actually, you're all just not pictures anymore, so I wouldn't be able to see you raise your hand or not. But I'm assuming that some of you are and some of you aren't. The affiliate response is something that Dr. Forkey calls the tend and befriend response to stress, right? So in a typical situation where a child is experiencing stress, they reach out and they look for people, right, that can help them through that stressful period, right? So the idea of tending and befriending is that when the stress comes, we find someone who can provide guidance, support, an ear, somebody to listen to us, or a voice for us, right? Because what happens for kids that are under toxic stress is their brain has changed physically, and also the way they think about themselves and their capacity to get through things, right? Because they are constantly in a situation where they are monitoring the environment for danger. I often use this example. I had a young man that I was working with when I was in Boston. I was the executive director of Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and we worked with runaway and homeless youth. And we had a drop-in program, a day program, where kids would come in off the streets for the day. They get breakfast and lunch. They'd meet with their counselors, or maybe attend a GED class or whatever. I would go down often during lunchtime and meet with kids and just kind of hang out. And there was a kid named Jamal that we became really good friends. He was 17 years old. He was trying to manage what he was going to do next in his life. He hadn't made any commitments about whether or not to go into shelter or whether to pursue education and all those kinds of things. But he loved coming and hanging out. And he always sought me out during lunchtime to kind of sit down and just kind of chat. And he liked to talk about sports, and he liked to talk about all kinds of things that I also was interested in. And so when we would have lunch together, it was very, we were friends. We were hanging out. We were just talking. We were just enjoying each other's company and each other's lives. And I remember one day when I was out going to a meeting. I was walking to a meeting across Boston Common, and I saw Jamal. And I walked up to Jamal, and I was ready to shake his hand. And I looked him in the eye, and he got into a fighting posture as I approached him. And I was like, Jamal, it's Robb. And then he kind of shook out of it. And he's like, oh, Robb, what's up? How you doing? How things going? And then it was like back to normal. But I realized pretty quickly when I debriefed with him the next day, I was like, what was that all about? He said, Robb, when I'm out on the street, all I'm looking for is what's next. He says, I'm not, it's different when I'm here and I feel safe, right? And so he has we need to create spaces and relationships for kids that are experiencing toxic stress, to be able to let down their guard and let down their fight or flight normal responses, and start to know that they can have relationship with people that can tend and befriend them and help them be able to change the way they see the world through their toxic stress, right? And so one of the ways, and this may not be very easy to see, but I can send these slides to you and the references that these slides come from. But to realize that kids need someone to help them navigate through their stress, need to have someone there to help them navigate through their trauma and start to reprogram the changes in their brain chemistry that they've already experienced, right? Now, this is not an easy process, but it's a possible process. And so a lot of our programs, a lot of you represent programs that are doing hopefully just that, creating safe spaces for kids to talk about what they've experienced and what they've gone through and how that might change for them in the future. But part of that is also realizing that we have caregivers that are in the lives of foster kids especially that need help with this as well. Foster parents need to be trained in how to deal with kids that have experienced trauma. We often get the question from funders, whether we're looking at funding our trauma therapy, what percentage of the kids that you serve have experienced trauma? And I'm always like 100%. Removal from their home alone is a traumatic experience, right? But there's also all the things that led up to them leaving. And so if we have all of these children entering into relationships with people that they don't know, how do we do the best that we can to train those folks, especially foster parents, residential programs, which do a much better job because they have that experience, to be able to deal with some of the behaviors that are just symptomatic of their stress and symptomatic of their trauma, right? And so one of the things, Dr. Forkey did when we honored Dr. Forkey at our gala, which was on March 7th. Yes, March 7th. It was the last public event before coronavirus shutdown happened. So we were very fortunate to get that in under the wire. But one of the things that she did is she changed CASA into kind of teaching points for us about what it means to help kids get on the road to resilience and get through their traumatic experiences. And so she used the CASA, the C of CASA as compassion. That we need to be in positions where we're listening to kids, that we're being present with kids, right? That we're not thinking about filling out the form for intake, but they're actually sitting there and being present with the child. We reflect back to the child any of the expressions and or needs that they've expressed or what they're looking for. Even if those aren't necessarily in their best interest, we need to reflect them back to let them know that they've been heard. So having compassion for the child and not asking what's wrong with you when a behavior emerges, but to ask what happened to you in our brains, right? Instead of realizing that the behavior is just symptomatic of the extreme trauma or stress that they're experiencing.
Rob, can I just interrupt you for one quick second? Because
Yeah.
just under that, I think one of the unique experiences that our children have is that many of them either feel responsible for breaking up their family or being removed from their homes, or have been told by their parents that they're responsible for doing that. So their trust level is really at such a low point for so many adults in their life that we really work hard to train our volunteers or to work with our volunteers to be that compassionate, listening person early on so that our kids begin to develop a trust in them and will share some of those experiences with them.
Right, and we also say be brutally honest with kids. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't say that you're going to advocate for that child to return home if you know that that's not safe at this point. Be honest and say, I will tell the judge that you want to go home, but my recommendation is still going to be that you don't go home, and here are the 5 reasons why, right? Being compassionate is listening, acknowledging that you've heard what they've said and reflecting that back to them so that they know that when I speak, this person at least I know is going to listen to me. I know that this person can become somebody that tends to my needs, right? Remember the tend and befriend? That they are tending to my needs as I move forward towards friendship, right? A is the availability piece, and this is just as important, right? Is being predictable, consistent, and reliable, and continuing the relationship over time. That's one of the things that I love most about CASA, our CASA volunteers. We ask a lot for them. Most people, when they're told you have to do 30 hours of training before you start, 12 hours of training every year, in addition to that, we want you to make a commitment to 12 to 16 months to be on the life of a case, and you're going to spend 10 to 12 hours a month doing it. Most people are like, yeah, you're crazy. But somehow we have 350 some odd volunteers that have made that commitment. And they're there predictably. One of the things is the hallmarks of CASA is that we visit the child at least once a month. And we're there whether the child wants to talk to us or not, no matter what, we show up and we are there for the kid. And in fact, for many kids, we are our volunteer is the only consistent adult that they've had over the whole life of their case. Because judges can change, lawyers can change, social workers can change, foster placements can change, everything can change. But over that period of time, we have one CASA that stays with that child the whole time. And that availability and predictability for kids allows us to go deeper with kids a lot of times quicker because they know no matter what, this guy or this woman is going to be in my life predictably because they're always there, they're showing up. Then the S is the safety piece, right? And this is not safety like making sure that the foster care home is safe because to be honest with you, 99.9% of foster families are fantastic. They're doing a great job. They have safe homes and all those kinds of things. This safety is really about the personal safety of the child, demonstrating that this is not like it was before, this relationship. That reactions that you have will not be met with distress, right? That you are with people who are making decisions with your needs in mind and what's safest for you, right? Always being a presence that allows them to know that no matter what happens, these people are here for your best interest. This person's here for your best interest. And then finally, the A of CASA is the attunement. seeing the world through the child's eyes, considering how the world is going to work is working for the child, right? And that's really our highest goal at CASA, is really to get a sense of how is this child experiencing their world? What are the things that they need that they're not getting? What are the things that they're getting that they don't need and are actually annoyances? Is this the best place for them culturally? Is this the best place? What is needed? How are they experiencing the world, right? Not what was the easiest for the people that are working in the system, but what's truly focused on what is best for the child and how the child will experience whatever we propose or that they're experiencing, right? And so that's really our goal, is to really think about how do we do those things through a volunteer corps, but also that a system can be challenged, supported, encouraged to identify the gaps and to make sure that we make the referrals so that those kids get the services. And so, like Lynn said, we saw a huge need. When I first started at CASA, I just spent about the first 2 or 3 weeks, I just went to court and I just sat and listened to court cases over and over and over again. And I kept hearing the same thing. I would hear one of our CASAs get up and say, "Judge, the child has been prescribed trauma therapy. They're not in trauma therapy, and we highly recommend that this child be put in trauma therapy." And the judge would look to the DCF attorney and say, "Why isn't this child in trauma therapy?" And the lawyer would say, "Well, they've made the referral, but it's a 6-month waiting list." Everybody kind of just shuffles their feet, looks at the ground, and they move on. And we said, well, that's not acceptable. We have to figure something out. And so we reached out to some partners, and we were lucky enough to get some funding to run a pilot. And it's really worked for us. So, we can pretty much get kids on our caseload that are not in trauma therapy, that need to be in trauma therapy, and I would assert all of them do. Within about 72 hours, we can get kids into trauma therapy. And now, even during COVID with the telehealth, being creative about making sure that those things are in place. Do we do the service? No. We refer it out, but we help build the system in order to support the kids. Because we know that that's critically important to have those supportive relationships that will do these kinds of things. Be compassionate, be available, have safety as a priority, and be attuned to how the child is living their life and the world that they're experiencing. So, in closing, before we do some questions and answers, here's a great quote that Dr. Forkey said during her speech at our gala. I have this printed out at my house by my desk in my office. I just think it's an incredible thing. We develop our understanding of ourselves not from ourselves, as is found in the American myth, but because it's reflected to us by those who care for us and are those safe, stable, nurturing relationships. I mean, that's our hope for every child, obviously, but it's especially for children that are in the foster care system that have experienced multi-levels of complex trauma, the trauma being removed from their home, often being moved from placement to placement to placement. Right now in the United States, the average length of time for a child in foster care is 21 months and 7 placements. Now, go ahead and do that math. And think about how horrific the system is for children experiencing the trauma of being removed from homes and being placed in new homes. We do a little better than that in Massachusetts, but not much. And so our goal is to help, how do we minimize that time and make that time not a time where kids go backwards, but kids can actually start to thrive even in the midst of foster care placement. So that's all we have for a presentation, unless you have anything else, Lynn.
No, I think we've covered it all.
So we're more than happy to take any questions that anybody has. And I don't know the best way to do this, Amy. You're going to manage the questions, or should I?
I had asked people to put a question in the chat if they had one, but it doesn't seem like people have. But I have some, so if you don't mind.
Yeah,
first of all, that was so amazing. It's information I've heard a bunch, but the way, you kind of delivered it was really resonant and impactful, and so appreciative of the work you do. One of the things that you said was the best wishes of the kid versus the interests. And, that I'm hoping you might be able to talk a little bit more about that. We know that's one of the features of trauma, and that's really hard to tease through.
Yeah. Yeah, do you want me to tell my story, Lynn?
Sure.
She doesn't know what story. Lynn is nervous right now because she doesn't know what story I'm going to tell. It's not really a story. It's a made-up story, right? So let's say a CASA volunteer is assigned to a 12-year-old girl, and every time she goes and visits her 12-year-old girl on her caseload, the child says, "I just want to go home. I want to be with my mother. I just want to go home. I want to be with my mother," right? Our goal is to advocate for their best interests, not for their wishes, right? So an attorney for that child, when they hear that, "I want to go home," they're responsible in Massachusetts, the way the court is set up in the juvenile court, to advocate for that child to go home, because that is the wishes of their client. Whether that be the client of the lawyer of the mother, the lawyer of the child, even the DCF, obviously are doing the wishes of DCF, right? Our job would be in that scenario to say, do an evaluation. Is it safe for this child to go home? Right? No, maybe it isn't at this point. Mom is not in compliance with her service plan. Mom is still actively using, opiates. Whatever reasons, it's not safe for her to go home. We would say to the child in that scenario, "I will tell the judge that you want to go home, but I want you to know that we are going to recommend that you don't go home because we don't believe it's safe yet. We hope that you understand that, but that's our job, is to make the best decision we can for your safety. And we think that's the best decision," right? So that's helping them remap, right? Because it's not something that they typically hear from people. What do we typically do to kids? We tell them what they want to hear so that they stop bothering us, especially for kids that are acting out. We tend to do those kinds of things, and we're not honest with kids. We have to be honest with kids no matter what, right? Even if it's things that we don't think they're going to hear. And we have to do this, and this is the hardest thing for youth workers. This is the hardest thing for people, professional people that are working with children and youth. We have to be able to risk the relationship for what's best. That's a hard thing to do. But what we find time and time again at CASA is when we do that, the kids then trust us more. The depth of the trust is higher. They may not want to talk to us the next 2 times we come, but we keep showing up and we keep having conversation, and then they back in it again with us, right? So that's the essence of the difference between the wishes of the child versus the best interest of the child. And that's a really hard thing. We spent a lot of time in training, right, Lynn, on talking about that, because that's a hard, especially for, nobody becomes a CASA volunteer or goes into social work or works with young people because they don't like kids, right? Or they want to get rich. Neither one of those really happens, right? What we do it because we're compassionate people that care about kids. But we also need to know that sometimes that means having difficult conversations and risking the relationship with that child even in order to do the right thing for that child.
We also will have conversations with kids about secrets, right? I mean, as well as the adults on the case. There's nothing for us that's off the record. We let people know, kids as well as parents on cases, that anything they tell us could possibly end up in a report. And a lot of times our volunteers, I think, are really reluctant to embrace that at the outset, saying, well, what if they don't tell me this? What if and I say, that is the risk that we run. But we have to tell kids that, maybe their secret doesn't keep them safe. And so that's our first priority, is to keep them safe. It might take them a little while longer to let us know that, to let us know what their secret is. But we do find that eventually, for most of our kids, they will come to a trusting place and share that information with their advocate. But it also, goes back to what I said earlier about, kids being told that they're the reason. We could have a child that's being sexually abused at home and her siblings are not. And her mom or dad or stepfather or whomever will say, don't tell DCF anything, or else you won't be able to come home. Your siblings won't be able to come home. We can't be a family. I can't imagine what that must feel like as a child, to have to keep that information inside or to try and deal with it. And so we do work hard to try and draw some of that out. Not on a therapeutic level. Oftentimes we'll ask kids if they're not comfortable speaking to us, do they want to write a letter to the judge? A lot of them will do that. That's very impactful for a judge to receive a letter from a child. And we always share what a child tells us with a judge. But we do explain to them that we are not advocating for them to return home at this time because we don't feel it's safe, and that's hard.
Yeah. And so let me just say, you know, depending on what kind of program you're running, this works or doesn't work for you.
Right.
If you're, because we're not mentors. So if you're in a mentoring program, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right, you have a different, the nature of your relationship with a child is different. If you're a therapist, the nature of your relationship with a child is different. If you're a coach of a baseball team, after school program or something like that, make sure you're basing whatever you're doing on the nature of the relationship you have with your kids, right, that are experiencing trauma. Don't say, oh, CASA does best interest, we should do it. No, don't. That's our job. That's why we were hired by the judge, right, even though they don't really pay us. That's why we do what we do, is because they are asking for an independent set of eyes to get to the best interest of that child. So we're not mentors of kids. We're not foster parents of kids. We're not any of those things. We're not friends of kids. We're advocates, and we explain that really clearly to kids. What does an advocate mean versus being a friend or being a, you know, those kinds of things. And so make sure that you're applying these principles in a way that is applicable to whatever your setting is. But one principle that I think is true across all domains here is that being honest with kids never hurts, even if it has the potential to hurt to break the relationship for a short period of time. I don't think we're honest with kids enough, and I don't think we set high enough goals with kids often enough. Kids will get to whatever goals they set with the support systems that we can provide for them. So being honest and setting high goals with kids, I think, goes across all domains. That's just my opinion.
I agree with it. Thank you for your emphasis on honesty and being trustworthy and authentic. I think that's important in most settings. And Lynn, I love that you connected it to this kind of secrets and lies often come with childhood trauma. So being honest is really important. Jeffrey said that he texted you a question, Rob, in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. I think he just went to you. Jeffrey, if you'd like to unmute, you could ask your question. I think Dodie also had a question. So if either of you want to just unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, so Jeffrey's question was, are CASA volunteers still seeing children in this time of the COVID? And yes, we are. In fact, we're seeing them more often. We're actually, typically our dosage is once a month, at least once a month. That's what we tell our volunteers. But during this period of time now, with the technology and video visits and phone calls and FaceTime and all that, we've been able to kind of do it. We're probably, I would say, on average twice a month, every other week. Some are doing it every week. Like right now, I have one child on my caseload as a volunteer, a young man who's in residential. I'm doing weekly Zoom meetings with him in his setting, just because he's so bored that he wants somebody to talk to. So it's more about him being bored than it is about the need for him to give me information or me to get information for him, but he's just looking for something to do, right? So but we're seeing that it's an increased amount of dosage that actually is happening during this time, which is interesting because I think we'll keep it, right? Like, this is an opportunity that we've learned in this, is that, one, we probably don't need to ever go back to the office at CASA. So, maybe once a week, maybe. Some of our staff will never need to step in our office again because our work is the ability is to do it remotely. Two, we've learned that remote visits are useful, but they're not the whole thing. So we'll never replace virtual visits with face-to-face visits, because who knows who's in the background, who's standing behind that camera saying, don't you say anything. We don't know whether that's happening or not in these virtual visits. So we're always going to need the face-to-face at least once a month, but maybe there can be an increased dosage with some virtual visits as well. And we learned a lot about that during when we instituted our virtual prison visit program, where kids were able to be at their home or in the DCF office and visit their parent who was incarcerated. And wow, it was such a powerful thing to watch. I worked with kids coming out of the juvenile justice system and 18 to 24-year-olds in the adult system for so many years, and to see these guys just melt when their 5-year-old daughter shows up on the video screen is just a powerful, powerful thing. So not only is it good for the children who we advocate for, but also the parent who is eventually going to come home and be an important person in that young person's life. So we have to be facilitating that relationship as well. Unfortunately, that's all shut down because there's no movement in the prisons right now, but hopefully that will start up again soon. So whatever we can do to facilitate contact during this time is really important. I think we're all learning that, right? As much as I hate seeing all your little heads every day on my screen in all the meetings that I'm in, I love it because I'm still connected, right? And sometimes I'm seeing more people differently, right? Like I never knew Dodie had a beautiful house like that. So now we get like tours of everybody's home, right? So like we get to know people differently, right? And so, those are the kinds of things I think we're learning in this, not only professionally, but personally. I'm sorry, I probably went way beyond my question, but.
That was great though. Important information. Dodie, would you like to ask your question?
You got on mute.
There we go. I think I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that. Robb, thank you so much for that. You're not really seeing much of my home. It's not that beautiful, but thank you. It's kind of a mess actually right now. We're working with Together for Kids, and we're also working with middle school age girls. And one of the things we're really worried about the under 5 or 6 set, right, is that there is no connection for them. There aren't public schools trying to reach out to them. They're often not in out of school time programs that know how to reach them. Some are being reached through their child care providers, which is terrific, but those child care providers also have a gazillion other things they're trying to manage, especially now as we're looking at the reopening. I just wanted to ask you and Lynn, is there anything that we can do either virtually or through trying to get materials to people that you think would be helpful to the kind of kids you're seeing? I mean, I think we're good with activities and, kind of the usual stuff, but, just want to ask if there's any kind of trauma sensitive particular resources that we could add. We have now figured out with Family Resource Center how to get some materials in any delivery that goes out to young families. So we kind of have a vehicle now, but just would love to have you respond to that if you would.
Yeah, I'll say a few seconds and then I'm going to give it to Lynn because she's been managing this for us. There's 2 ways that you can do that with CASA, right? So we have 350 volunteers that are going out and delivering anything that we've identified people need, kids need, or the foster families need, right? So we've done not only technology, but school supplies, games, puzzles, puppets, anything that might be helpful for a kid. And we get that feedback from the volunteers who are in contact with those families. But we've also done gift cards for food, right? What we're finding is that there's some food insecurity that's happening in the foster care system for a couple of reasons. One, if you have 3 foster kids and you've been responsible up until now for dinner for those kids, and now you also have breakfast and lunch because those kids used to get breakfast and lunch at school, but now are not getting breakfast and lunch at school. Now you're looking at 3 times 2 times 7, right? Do the math. How many more meals? Whatever cost per meal. So we're getting food cards, food, like from grocery stores, gift cards into people's hands, those kinds of things. If you're interested in looking at the kinds of things that we're looking for to get into hands of young people, we have an Amazon wish list that's on our website. It's right in the center of the middle section. You can just check it out. If you have a program that you want to kind of copy our wish list, do it. If you'd like to support the 500 and some odd kids that we're working with right now that are in foster placements and want to purchase something, we'd be more than happy to do that. And you can always write a check. You can always write a check to CASA. So all those things are acceptable ways to do that. But we have a delivery system that happens through Lynn's coordination. I want her to talk a little bit about how we've been doing that, Lynn.
Well, I think too, Dodie, if I'm not mistaken, you're also talking about just some separate resources or sites that people may be able to access. And a couple of our supervisors have weekly, they put together a list. And so I'm sure that I could get that in Robb's hands or get it out to you or to everyone about some of the resources that we have been able to find that address, some of it's educational issues. I think some of it is about there's an early childhood education program that was providing telehealth to children that are between the ages of 3 and 5. Because most of the children that we refer need to be over the age of 4 for mental health services. So it's a pretty exhaustive list. Some sites may no longer be valid, but we're happy to send that information out that we've collected to anybody that is looking for it. Our volunteers have been awesome. I think initially they were a little slow to really understand what we were trying to offer to people, because over the years we've made it very clear, no gifts, for kids. Like, you could bring coloring books, you can bring nail polish, things like that, but we wanted kids to really understand what we were doing there and to not expect something every time we were coming. And now we're talking about gifts. Like, we were able to get somebody a mountain bike. We've provided, thankfully through generous donors, we've clothes, right? Toys, books, MP3 players, wireless headphones. We've had some not unusual requests, but some of the residential facilities, so kids could have an MP3 player as long as they didn't have a camera, right? So we are sensitive to what the restrictions are for some of our children. And we did certainly clear with DCF the fact that we were getting laptops and tablets into kids' hands. And, they're working with foster parents as far as security issues or things of that nature. So it really runs the gamut. And when we have things in and the current volunteer on the case can't do it, either their supervisor does it or another volunteer steps up. So if you're looking, if you have kids that you have items for that need to be delivered, you could certainly reach out to us as well, because our volunteers are anxious to get whatever they can into any child's hand that's in need.
All right, next question. I think.
Go ahead, Christine. Yep, she's ready to go.
Ready. Hi, everybody. So I'm very lucky to have learned about my childhood through therapy later on in life, but I learned about it through the ACE study, and when therapists started asking what my childhood was like. And so what I will say is that I don't think teachers really knew what was going on, because once I got to school, to preschool to kindergarten, I was like, this is a place where the grown-ups aren't breaking my stuff. So this is great. I want to hang out here and learn and be, a helper. So if there was ever a new kid in class, I would help that person. So I just got to be really complicitly cooperative and nice and respectful. And so no one really knew anything was going on until way later. But I hope people listen to, I found a really good podcast about the ACE study and what legislators think about things that happen to people in childhood, if that impacts them later on. And it goes into how legislators don't believe that there is much risk involved in witnessing domestic violence and neglect as they would physical abuse or sexual abuse. And that's a bummer, because when you live in an environment where it's helpful for you to not be seen ever, you're going to get a lot of behaviors that you might not think. It's I don't know, and then other people have an experience where they act out at school, where school is not safe for them. And I guess I had the opposite experience, and trying to get public opinion to change about how we think about our childhoods. It's a long process, and it's definitely a thing that all legislators don't know about, is what the podcast gets into as well. And then I won't spend too much more time, but I'm trying to use my experiences to kind of navigate the political scene in Worcester, and I try to show up to public meetings and try to talk about this stuff, and then people don't get back to you, or it feels so unsafe because people are saying stigmatizing things in the meetings. There's cops there. So then getting involved becomes triggering, and once someone maybe innocently doesn't listen to you or puts you down in some way, it's like game over, I'm done. So that's how quick you can kind of betray somebody and not even realize it. And have kids maybe having that happen ongoingly and just never speaking up about it. And meanwhile, you think they're fine because they're not saying that they're not. And they could be storing so much betrayal and anguish that they have nothing, they don't know how to be honest. And then the last thing, I'll stop talking, is dogs. Oh my God, dogs. The other thing that helped me survive my upbringing was I was the neighborhood kid who would watch anyone's dog when they were away on vacation. So I was allowed like in the neighbors' houses with their dogs, and I would do that as much as possible to not be in my home. And then I finally got to volunteer with them at the shelter in Boston. And I swear, like just everywhere in Worcester, make it dog friendly. Anytime you have therapy with kids, anytime you're doing anything with kids, like ask if a dog can come, if like, because they're not people. Dogs aren't people. So by design, they're infinitely better. And that's not something you get when you go to like a primary care doctor. They're not going to prescribe you like a dog to help with your emotions. So those are some suggestions I have. I would like to write all kinds of laws about how to make kids' lives better, because I have an insider's perspective, especially on all the ways that interventions could have happened for me and my siblings, but never did. So thank you all for listening. I'm going to mute now and chill out.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate that. You know, you hit on a really critical piece there. From your experience, you reacted differently to your trauma than others maybe you witnessed, right? And so we just never know. It's based on personality. It's based on kind of resiliency factors. It's based on a lot of things on what we're going to see. And the reality is the behavior is never is only symptomatic of what it's experienced, right? So instead of saying what's the matter with you when somebody does something, right? Like I have to catch myself with my kids all the time to say that. I say that probably to my 19-year-old sons more than I should. What is the matter with you? Like I feel like I say that way too much. And then I go, wait a second, it's supposed to be what happened to you. And then I got to go, well, what did I do to them? Right? And then I get all caught up in that. But I think there's a real nuance that you brought up, Christine, that's so valuable to this discussion, is that we miss out sometimes on kids that are not problematic behavior, that have problematic behavior, because we just aren't attuned to the fact that that might be a response, right? And so that child that's, and the way I've learned to kind of identify that on a very small level is that, you know, that kid that always becomes your shadow in a program, like every time you turn around, that kid's there. They're there because the value of the relationship and that relationship. And if they're not a problem child, right? Like we like to give those labels. We love to label kids, right? That kid's that kid's, that's where we run into the biggest problem in this whole area of trauma, is that we label them by their behavior instead of realizing that the behavior is symptomatic of what's happened to them, right? And so it's easy to just put those kids are that way, these kids are this way, that, right? And it's so damaging to our program and the way that we deliver our services. So being aware that trauma can manifest itself in a lot of different ways based on the composition of that child, personality, biology, experiences, all those kinds of things, is really important to stay attuned to that. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, Christine.
I think too, for our volunteers, as they've gotten into this and they come across children's behavior that they don't understand or they're trying to understand, we also try and provide as many outside opportunities for them to participate. And certainly in the last few years with ACEs and all the webinars and workshops that have been out there, a lot of our volunteers have participated in it. And I think, you know, sort of had that aha moment either for themselves or for a child that they're working with, where some of those behaviors and what those behaviors mean, right, becomes meaningful in a way that they can incorporate it into information that they're giving to a judge or sharing, you know, perhaps with a therapist or you know, talk among foster parents. So I think that's been really helpful for us as well, is when the more informed we can make our volunteers, right? The better able they are to have relationships with their children.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Dodie, that it is different for as a parent. It's definitely different. Yeah, because I think that's the. I mean, I can speak from experience. As much experience over 30 years that I have working with high-risk youth populations, when my kid got in trouble, I was useless. Totally useless. Everything that I learned went out the window, right? And so it's so true. And that's why we have professionals that help us from outside, right? To come alongside us. So good point. Who's next, Amy?
C, you're up.
Hi, thank you so much for having this. I wanted to just tag the fact that you're talking about trauma looking very different. I completely agree, and I don't think that there is enough known, for instance, in instances of manifestations of that, just like child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, where children appear very happy, compliant, amiable, just the picture perfect health, but things sort of are kind of tweaked and don't add up. I'm stating this as a tag to, I guess, the backdrop of my question, because this is often coinciding with trying to get the child help throughout the process from the very beginning to, having actual interaction and working with a case and at the end. And I'm wondering what you think. What do you do to help support non-offending family members who are targeted and discredited by the abuser and the system created by the abuser in order to confuse the system and hide the abuse? How do you make the discernment? It seems so biased, and the fact that there's so little science that is applied, because it kind of seems very individual. Well, the child seems okay. Well, they said that they wanted to go back, and meanwhile, you don't know the level of, say, ritual abuse or duress that the child is under, waiting the impending, transfer or anything like that. So I just was curious what your experience was, and if you've seen anything kind of changing in the system as well as your own experience.
I have some clues about this, or how maybe to think more critically about behavior from families, if it's chill for me to talk about that for a little bit. I know I did a lot of talking, so I don't want to steal space from anybody else, but there are some indicators that I kind of went through in my own history to probably lead you to believe that something more is happening with a family than meets the eye.
Let's let Robb or Lynn tackle it first, and then if you want to jump in, that would be helpful.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I'm answering the question properly, but I'll try. So I think we do a variety of different things, right? Some things we have control over, and some things we do not. So any child that we believe has been sexually abused, and typically we're not the first line of information, right? Finding that out. Usually the abuse has happened before they come into care. However, there are many situations in which kids are removed from their home for one reason, and then as they feel more comfortable in a foster home, will then disclose what, more of what's happened, or different kinds of situations. So we do work with DC, very closely with DCF, as well as sometimes with local law enforcement, as far as reporting that information, right? So if we receive it, we'll file a 51A, but also to recommend that they get a SANE interview right through the district attorney's office. And I assume that most of you are aware of that. One of the things that, I think has long been an issue is who gets to a child first. And you always want to make sure that it's a trained investigator, right? And that's not always DCF, right? And I think this SANE interview process has been incredibly important to people who have experienced sexual abuse because they don't have to continually tell their story over and over again. It is being done by a trained forensic investigator. DCF is behind the window. You know, there are police officers behind the window. You know, so it limits the exposure that children have to having to tell that story over and over again. I do think that there's a lot of conversation back and forth between our volunteers and their supervisors about what a behavior may or may not mean. Certainly we're not professional therapists, nor are our volunteers. So again, we have an open dialogue with DCF social workers and the courts about what this child is reporting to us and what's happening. And do understand that in different cases, it impacts people differently, as well as what their behaviors are, right? I mean, kids can be very aggressive and act out. They can, you know, withdraw into a shell. But one of the things that we work very, very hard with is that there are times, and this is, I don't always understand this, is that DCF will sometimes go back to the biological parent to ask if it's okay to have a SANE interview. And I don't actually think that that's an option that should be on the table for parents that, you know, for children that have been removed. I think that needs to be in the hands of professionals, because I think a child having the opportunity to tell that story is important. And
that is a current conversation that's happening at the child, what is the Child Advocacy Center. I'm on that task force, and you know, we're trying to look at some legislative tweaks in that, or policy. That's more of a policy tweak that needs to happen in DCF. There are you know, you'll never hear me say a bad thing about DCF, because they have a hard job. They have very few resources. 99% of the people that are involved with DCF really care about kids. There are always situations that things are bad, but that's true of any place.
Can't have you behind me, please. Go to the living room. I need to talk to somebody here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
But
I need to say something, and my grandson is making noise. I apologize. I need to say something here. I am so sorry. Okay, can I?
All right. So there are definitely ways in which we can, you know, those are the things that's the next level, right? Is the advocacy level that's different than what we do for kids, is really identifying those policies and procedures that are actually compounding trauma, and also the legislative ones, right? So Christine, I think you're on the right track when you say, let's identify some things that are really legislatively can be addressed, policy and procedure wise addressed in the department, that are going to make lives of kids better. One example would be the way that they get permission to do a SANE interview. The DA's office believes that they should be able to do a SANE interview anytime they see it as needed. DCF is on a different side of the fence because of their current policies and procedures, right? So how do we make that thing work, and how do we advocate for that is a completely different thing. So, but I appreciate the question, C. I think one of the things from CASA perspective is we have to stay in our lane, unfortunately, because we're assigned by the court, and our job is to observe, record, and report what we see. So if we hear that a child's been abused, we report it immediately. We'll do an emergency report to the court. We'll file 51A. If we hear of a crime being committed, on those kinds of things, those are the things that are a response. But we are, you know, we're not paid investigators. There are court investigators. They should be revealing that. You can say what you want to say about the court investigation process. Some investigators are fantastic. Other ones struggle. You know, and so we have to. Our role in it is to observe, which means hearing, seeing, and then record it by the actual legal document that we submit as evidence to the court, and then report it to the court through that process. So
do you feel that like a residual or like even unconscious bias kind of builds? Because in traumatic situations, what I've noted is that the protective party would even seem more frazzled, harried, all over the place, while, you know, an abusive party is cool as a cucumber. But yet what sometimes gets detected on a superficial level is, well, that person is obviously not the most safest place for a child to go. Meanwhile, what they've been enduring is this onslaught. And I was just wondering if you found in your career that does kind of like build in, I guess, being so so inundated day in and day out as a advocate, you know, that you begin to make shortcut judgments or calls about that when you do the reporting, and if that does kind of factor in.
Yeah, the good news is that that's not our job. That's DCF's job.
Got it.
So we're not making those determinations as CASA volunteers or as an agency. If we see or hear something, we report it, right? So a lot of times we'll submit a report at court, and a lawyer will tell us in the hallway. We'll approach our volunteer and say, your report's full of hearsay, and we go, yeah, it is, because that's our job. We heard something and we reported it, right? So a lot of what's in our report is hearsay. This person told us. We don't determine whether it's truthful or not. We report what we've heard. So that's what the judges want. They want to hear everything, and then the judge's responsibility and DCF's responsibility is to react to that, right? And to make decisions based on that. Now, the good news is that we are allowed to voice our concerns and also our recommendations. And we're really happy that 88% of our recommendations are enacted by the court, right? Because we are we're spending 12 to 15 hours on this case every month, gathering information from disparate places, right? So if we hear from a therapist, from the child, and from a neighbor, well, maybe not a neighbor, but the aunt, that there is this thing happening in this home that hasn't been reported yet, we're now reporting to the court 3 different ways something that's been happening that maybe nobody's aware of yet, right? That's how we go about doing our business. But we don't get to make the decision where the child goes. DCF does, and the judge will try to make sure that happens in a way. But at the end of the day, DCF is in charge of making those decisions of where a child's ultimately going to be. Not even the judge makes that decision. The judge has the most power at the very beginning of the case and the most power at the end of the case, whether or not to terminate parental rights, which is an ominous decision. To say that you are no longer a parent of this child is a huge, huge decision that needs to be made. And getting as much information into the judge's hands in order to make that decision is what we feel like we play a very significant role in.
And see, like as Rob said, we don't differentiate. We just report information. We report it to DCF and we put it in our court report so that it's not hidden and it's both places. So and our volunteers, because they don't have real professional experience in making those determinations, just continue to come to us with either allegations that a child's making, disclosures that a child's making, and again, those all go into our report. And then there's a separate conversation that will go on in the courtroom between the judge and DCF about how they're handling that particular situation. But we don't sweep any of that under the rug, for lack of a better reason. And we are not always able to determine the truth. So again, as Rob said, we're observing, recording, and reporting. Most of our 95% of our report is I can't say it's factual, but it's facts given to us by somebody that we report to a judge. And then there is a little bit of leeway in there for us to voice our opinion about what was reported to us.
So, Amy, I have 5 more minutes and then I have to go. Lynn's going to stick around for more questions, but I saw a question from Moo.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
I would like to address before I go.
Yeah, you got it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, he says he's curious, or I don't know if it's he or she, but curious about mentorship or trauma stewardship practices for advocates who experience secondary trauma. That's a great question because we see it, definitely see it. One of the things that I made Lynn stop doing to me was sending me every single court appointment that we got, so I didn't have to read through all of the trauma every day. Lynn still has to. I don't have to anymore because I'm just like, I'm not built for that, right? Like I'm not built to hearing those stories over and over again. I'm better at creating context for other people to be really good at that. So that's why I'm the executive director, and I can't do what our staff does. I get too angry, and I want to fight people. So that's why I don't do that. But what we're seeing is that we have staff and volunteers that really need support when they have a tough case, and they're all tough. Let's be honest, they're all tough. But some of them tap into previous experiences for them, either personally or with somebody they know, and all those kinds of things. And so we have several outlets for that, one-on-one with their supervisor. Both Lynn and I are trained therapists, even though we're not professionally practicing therapy right now, but we can support in that way. We have monthly vent sessions, we call them, for our volunteers, where they can come in and talk about the particulars of their case and how they're experiencing that. Right, and then we also have another. We do brown bag lunches on 1,000 different topics a year, where people come in and that often brings up other things as well for people. So we try to provide as much support as we possibly can. Our staff who oversee the volunteers or supervise the volunteers are constantly asking those kind of leading questions. How are you doing? How are you experiencing this? Is there anything that you need in support? Right, those kinds of things. So we probably have 5 or 6 different outlets, Mumu, that we try to address that. Obviously, we don't catch 100% of it. Sometimes we have volunteers that just disappear because they can't handle it and they just kind of walk away. And then we have to kind of either track them down or assign somebody else. But that's a great question, and it's always it's one of those things that we're always thinking about and trying to get better at.
Robb, thank you so much. I know you have to go on to something equally important, and we really appreciate you being here. Lynn is willing and able to stick around. Thank you, Lynn. I do think we probably have some more questions. I don't know from the chat, but
I don't know that I can see all the questions, so I'm happy to answer any. I'm just not sure that I can.
If anyone has a question right now, you can unmute yourself to ask it. That would be fine.
I texted the question. I don't know if you guys saw it. I apologize about the noise earlier. My family is here, and I had to get into my room. My grandson, and they're playing out there.
Do you want to ask your question now that you are unmuted, though?
Yes, I unmuted. Yes. So my question is, what if the mother of the child coached the child not to speak in the SANE interview because the perpetrator was one of her family members and the child didn't speak? He said he couldn't speak or he didn't want to speak. Something like that.
I think unfortunately that happens more than any of us would like. I think for CASA, we may have a little bit of an advantage in the sense of parents, in our cases, don't have that much access to children unsupervised, especially in sexual abuse cases. So the forensic investigators are working with those children alongside therapists, prior to the SANE interview, to help a child through that process. We certainly have had situations in which a child has asked the CASA to be present during the SANE interview. We are not allowed in the room, understandably so, but we will, and we can't bring children in cars, right? But we will meet children at the site where the SANE interview is taking place and let them know we're there. We'll be there when they go in, and we'll be there when they go out. So again, I'm not necessarily sure that I'm asking your question, but that is left up to somebody in a position different than mine about access to parents. But most of our children, especially where sexual abuse has been alleged, are not having unsupervised visitation with their parents.
Does the SANE interview, is the SANE interview repeated?
Not typically.
in the case that the child didn't say anything?
There have been situations that I'm aware of where a child has gone back a few months later, either because they're a little bit older and they feel, that the first time maybe they were judged not to be a competent witness, for lack of a better word, and maybe with a little bit more time, that's happened. I mean, it's certainly not unheard of, but I do think the DA has very specific regulations, again, for lack of a better word, about how much time needs to elapse between sane interviews.
Okay. So, and how do we know the results? Because we haven't heard anything about the results. Of course, then we went down into the lockdown for the COVID-19 and stuff like that.
But when you say we don't know the results, who are we?
We, the family, don't know anything. I'm talking, the case I'm talking about is actually my grandchild.
Okay. I mean, I wasn't looking for specific information, but I didn't know if you meant like as a foster parent or a relative or things like that. These cases are our cases are all confidential, so we can't share information with anybody. So if we know there's a sane interview and you, for example, were an aunt of the child on the case, we can't share that information with you. The DCF
I understand that.
Right, but the DCF social worker could, and perhaps, or the child's attorney is the other person that I would reach out to about what's occurred. Those are the people that could disclose information to family members. We cannot. The only person that we could disclose information to, other than in our office, is a DCF social worker. Like, we can't disclose. We may have information that foster parents don't have about a child, but we can't disclose that to them. Same is true of a classroom teacher. We go in and ask questions, and we certainly identify ourselves, but we don't give them any information about a case. And in some situations, teachers don't know children are even in foster care. And we don't share that with them either.
Yeah, he's not in foster care, never been. But I was, concerned about the outcome of, the sane interview, how it was affected because he was coached and all that stuff. Yeah. How do you guys deal with that? I mean, how is the truth going to come out if this child is being coached by the mother?
Yeah. As I said, that's not something that we, we'll make the recommendation for the sane interview, but that's as far as we could take it. What happens after that becomes or falls under the purview of the district attorney's office in DCF.
Yeah.
Lynn, someone asked a question about cultural differences and wondering if you've had situations where we have new immigrants to this country and they have really different sort of rules and practices in their culture, and now they're being judged by our cultural practices and standards, and how have you managed that?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, we've certainly tried to recruit a more diverse population, and we've been successful from our end. However, I will tell you that I have been in the courtroom multiple times over the 20-odd years that I've worked there, where I have heard a judge say repeatedly, "This is the United States. It falls under our rules, regulations, and laws. You may not physically abuse your child in this country." So while we can be culturally sensitive to certain situations that are happening in a home, once it rises to the level of child abuse, and all of our cases are already in the court system, I will say that there's not much wiggle room for families as far as violating the law or abusing children. Judges, at least in Worcester County, in my experience, don't have any tolerance for that. And it's not as if they'll, I think I also need to make it clear that the proceedings that we're involved in are not criminal matters. They can be happening simultaneously to the juvenile court proceeding. For example, a child endangerment charge or a sexual abuse charge can also be happening to a parent in criminal court. We are just dealing with juvenile court and whether or not we're recommending the best permanent placement for a child, right? Can they go home because parents have been able to make their home safe, or that's not happened, and we feel our recommendation would be that they be freed for adoption.
Lynn, someone else had asked about how to get involved as a CASA volunteer, and also wondering if having any past DCF contact or involvement would exclude them or disqualify them.
That is a great question. I mean, we certainly, if you go to our website, or I think maybe Rob put that up early on, there's an application to become a volunteer on there. We do run a CORI check on everyone, as well as a DCF background check. I will say that having DCF experience interaction doesn't preclude you from becoming a volunteer. And also having something on your CORI doesn't either. It just matters what it is and how old it is. Certainly if you've been involved in any sort of allegations regarding children, you wouldn't be accepted into the program. And you can't have an active open case with DCF. So we take it on a case-by-case basis is the short answer to the question. So neither precludes you from becoming a volunteer, but we do have those conversations with you if we feel like you can't be, or if we feel like you can. There are other situations as well that there are people that are red flagged throughout training that may not be appropriate to take a case for a variety of reasons. And so we do work with those people maybe to volunteer with CASA in a different way.
I haven't seen any other questions. I think I caught everybody's question that just kind of sent it in through the chat bar. But we could just, give it a minute or two. And if anybody has anything else and they want to jump in, please do.
Okay.
Hearing nothing other than chainsaw in the background. Just again, thank you so much for this training. Clearly it was of interest to so many of us, and great information, and the job you are doing is amazing. I can't even imagine how life-changing that can be for a kid. So appreciate
it. The opportunity. We really appreciate being able to talk to people about what we do, because I think sometimes if you're not familiar with juvenile court, you don't know what happens there.
Agree. I hope that this translates too into more volunteers, donations. If people were moved by what they heard, hopefully they want to support you however they can. We really do appreciate that you're the voice for kids that have had their voice taken from them. It's amazing.
Thanks so much, Amy. I appreciate the opportunity.
Excuse me? Excuse me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Is it possible to get to view the this meeting again I just missed the beginning a little bit, and that was explaining basically a breakdown of what it is your role was and what you do. And so is it possible to maybe revisit this meeting?
Absolutely. We record all of our sessions, and it takes, several hours, but once we get the recording back, we'll post it on our Facebook page. I can also send it to Lynn and Rob if they want to have it for their volunteers. And I'm sure that they would also be willing to share the PowerPoint. We can share that out as well. And our next up session is on the trauma of immigration. And Alex Meridian is a attorney who's doing that for us, also here right now as Mumu. So we're really looking forward to having him come on, and we will definitely get this out. I think it is information that we'd love to see shared with lots of audiences and shared widely. So thank you all so much for being here. Yeah, okay, great. And other people are saying yes. They're going to send things your way, and volunteers, and spread the good word about the work you're doing.
Great.
So thank you so much.
How can we help though? Can they tell us how, in what way we can help? What can we do to be of help?
Yes.
You got that, Lynn?
Yes. So what we can do is, and I don't know how to share that first page, Amy, maybe, or, oh, you know what, that's probably on Rob's. maybe what we could do is just get contact information. But if you visit our website, right, all the information about donations or anything like that is on that. And it's, to remember, because we changed it not too long ago, right? So it's www.CASA Worcester County. No, that's not right. That's the old one. TheCASAproject.org, right?
TheCASAproject.org. Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely look into it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Have a great day, everybody.
You too.
You too. Thanks so much, Lynn.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.